The morning had begun like countless others in President Ibrahim Traoré's carefully structured life. At 5:30 a.m., as the first call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou's sprawling neighborhoods, he had risen from his modest bed in the presidential residence, a simple room he had deliberately kept unchanged from his predecessor's more austere arrangements. The ornate furnishings and golden fixtures that had once symbolized power and privilege had been quietly donated to museums, replaced with functional furniture that reflected his commitment to revolutionary simplicity. His daily routine was ritualistic in its precision, born from military discipline and shaped by the understanding that every moment of a revolutionary leader's day carried weight beyond personal preference. 30 minutes of exercise in the small courtyard behind his office, reading intelligence briefings while drinking coffee from a simple ceramic mug that had belonged to his adoptive father, reviewing the day's scheduled meetings with his chief of staff, and spending 15 minutes in quiet reflection. Not prayer, exactly, but something deeper than mere planning. This morning, however, something felt different. As Ibrahim reviewed the day's agenda, meetings with agricultural cooperatives, a session with his economic advisors about the ongoing negotiations with international mining companies, and an evening address to student organizations at the University of Ouagadougou, his attention kept drifting to the single unscheduled item at the bottom of the page. Personal time, Central Market visit. The notation was innocuous, written in his own handwriting during a moment of inexplicable impulse the previous evening. For months, he had felt drawn to spend time in the places where ordinary Burkinabe citizens lived their daily lives, not as carefully orchestrated presidential visits with security cordons and prepared speeches, but as authentic encounters with the people whose struggles had motivated his rise to power. His security detail, led by the perpetually vigilant Captain Abdoulaye Ouedraogo, had initially resisted these informal excursions. The captain, a career military officer whose loyalty to Ibrahim was matched only by his professional paranoia about potential threats, understood the political value of such visits, but worried constantly about the security implications of a president who insisted on accessibility over protection. "Mr. President," Ouedraogo had argued during their weekly security briefing, "these unannounced visits create tactical nightmares. We cannot adequately secure locations we haven't surveilled, and your presence in crowded public spaces makes threat assessment nearly impossible." But Ibrahim had learned to trust his instincts about connecting with ordinary citizens, understanding that authentic leadership required more than policy expertise and diplomatic skill. The revolution that had brought him to power was rooted in popular support, and maintaining that connection demanded constant attention to the lived experiences of people whose voices were rarely heard in presidential palaces. "Captain," he had replied, with the gentle firmness that characterized his leadership style, "the greatest threat to our revolution is not physical attack, but disconnection from the people we serve. Security is important, but isolation from our citizens is a greater danger than any individual threat." As his modest convoy, a single Toyota Land Cruiser accompanied by one support vehicle, deliberately chosen over the armored limousines favored by previous administrations, made its way through Ouagadougou's bustling streets, Ibrahim reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of leadership. At 34, he was among the youngest heads of state in Africa, yet his path to power had been marked by the kind of experiences that aged men beyond their years. The military coup that had brought him to power 18 months earlier had not been motivated by personal ambition but by profound frustration with the corruption and incompetence of the previous regime. Burkina Faso's vast mineral wealth, gold, manganese, and other precious resources, had been systematically extracted by foreign companies while ordinary citizens struggled with poverty, unemployment, and inadequate public services. His adoptive parents, both teachers who had instilled in him a deep love of learning and social justice, had died within months of each other during his final year at the military academy. Their passing had left him with grief, but also with clarity about his purpose: to serve the people of Burkina Faso with the same dedication and selflessness they had demonstrated throughout their lives. Yet as successful as his presidency had been, international, Observers praised his anti-corruption initiatives, his renegotiation of mining contracts to benefit Burkina Faso citizens, and his investments in education and healthcare. Ibrahim carried a persistent sense of incompleteness, as if some essential part of his identity remained unresolved. The feeling had intensified recently, particularly during quiet moments when the demands of governance gave way to personal reflection. Late at night, alone in his office, he would sometimes find himself humming melodies that seemed to emerge from memory without conscious effort, songs that carried emotional resonances he couldn't quite place. Dreams featured fragments of images, soft hands braiding his hair, a woman's voice singing in Mooré, the scent of karité butter and millet flour that felt simultaneously foreign and intimately familiar. His adoptive parents had been loving but cautious about discussing his origins, sharing only that his birth mother had been unable to care for him due to economic hardship. They had provided him with stability, education, and moral guidance, but they had also left gaps in his personal history that he had learned to accept as permanent mysteries. As the convoy approached the central market, Ibrahim felt the familiar surge of energy that came from witnessing the creativity and resilience of his people. This was the Burkina Faso he fought to protect and elevate, not the sterile conference rooms where international agreements were negotiated, but the vibrant spaces where ordinary citizens created value through their own intelligence and determination. The market stretched before them like a living organism, pulsing with the rhythms of commerce and community that had sustained African societies for millennia. Vendors arranged their goods with artistic precision, creating displays that were simultaneously functional and beautiful. Women carried impossible loads with fluid grace that made their burdens appear weightless. Children wove through the crowd with the confident navigation of those for whom this chaos represented home and security. Ibrahim stepped from his vehicle with genuine anticipation, immediately feeling the embrace of familiar sounds and smells that connected him to his deepest sense of belonging. This was where policy became personal, where abstract economic theories translated into the daily realities of families working to build better lives for their children. His security details spread out with professional discretion, close enough to respond to threats, but far enough away to allow genuine interactions with citizens who might otherwise be intimidated by obvious protection. Captain Ouedraogo positioned himself where he could monitor both the president and the surrounding crowd, his trained eyes constantly scanning for anything unusual or potentially dangerous. The cotton traders who approached Ibrahim first were men whose weathered hands and sun-darkened faces testified to years of agricultural work under the harsh Sahelian sun. Their conversation quickly moved beyond pleasantries to substantive discussions about crop yields, international price fluctuations, and the ongoing challenges of adding value to their products locally rather than exporting raw materials to European factories. "Mr. President?" said Musa, the eldest of the group, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived decades of farming in an unpredictable climate. "We appreciate your efforts to renegotiate our trade agreements, but we need more support for processing facilities. We cannot build Africa's future by sending our cotton to France and buying back their finished textiles." Ibrahim nodded with genuine respect for the man's analysis, understanding that this farmer possessed insights about global economics that many university-trained economists lacked. These conversations provided him with ground-level intelligence about the effectiveness of his policies, unfiltered by bureaucratic intermediaries who might soften criticism or exaggerate successes. "Musa," he replied, "you are absolutely right. Economic sovereignty requires more than renegotiating contracts. It means building our own capacity to transform our resources into finished products that our people need." As they discussed the specific technical and financial challenges involved in establishing local textile processing facilities, Ibrahim felt his attention beginning to fragment. Something in his peripheral vision had captured his awareness with an intensity that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to memory. Across the narrow pathway, barely visible in the shadows cast by crumbling colonial-era buildings, sat an elderly woman whose presence seemed to bend the air around her with quiet desperation. Her clothing hung in faded tatters, and her weathered hands clutched a small metal cup with the desperate intensity of someone for whom survival depended on the uncertain generosity of strangers. But it was not her obvious poverty that arrested Ibrahim's attention. Unfortunately, Ouagadougou's streets were filled with similar scenes of economic displacement. Instead, something indefinably familiar in her posture. The way she tilted her head slightly to the right when lost in thought triggered memories so deep they felt more like ancestral knowledge than personal. Experience Ibrahim's conversation with the cotton traders became increasingly difficult to maintain as his attention was drawn irresistibly toward the elderly woman sitting against the wall. Her presence seemed to create ripples in his consciousness, awakening memories that had been buried beneath decades of education, military training, and political responsibility. The shape of her nose, aquiline and proud despite the ravages of street life, triggered flashes of recognition that seemed to emerge from cellular memory rather than conscious recollection. The curve of her lips, still generous even though malnutrition had hollowed her cheeks, belonged to someone whose face had been the first and most important in his earliest years of life. She was humming, barely audible above the market's ambient noise, but the melody cut through the chaos with laser precision to reach something profound in Ibrahim's heart. It was the same traditional Mouré song about the baobab tree's ability to survive drought and storm, its roots reaching deep into the earth while its branches stretched toward heaven. That had once been his lullaby during nights when childhood fears made sleep impossible. His breathing became shallow as fragments of sensory memory began assembling themselves into coherent recollections. The texture of hands that had once braided his hair each morning before school, always smelling of karité butter and the millet flour she ground before dawn to sell at this very market. A gentle voice that had sung traditional songs while preparing meals over their small charcoal brazier, weaving stories about ancestors and resistance that had shaped his earliest understanding of African identity and dignity. Captain Ouedraogo noticed his president's sudden stillness and instinctively shifted into higher alert mode. His hand moved closer to his weapon while his eyes scanned the crowd for potential threats, trying to identify what had captured Ibrahim's attention so completely. The security officer had been trained to read body language, and Ibrahim's current posture, frozen, vulnerable, emotionally unguarded, represented exactly the kind of moment when leaders became targets. But Ibrahim's mind had traveled far from security concerns, racing backward through 34 years to the day that remained vivid despite every effort to bury it beneath layers of achievement and responsibility. The hollow ache in his young chest when he realized she was truly gone. The questions his adoptive family could never adequately answer. The gradual, painful acceptance that some losses were permanent and had to be carried rather than healed. The woman looked up momentarily, drawn perhaps by the intensity of his gaze, and their eyes met across the crowded pathway. In that instant, time seemed suspended between memory and reality, between the child he had been and the leader he had become. Ibrahim felt his carefully constructed world shift on its axis as certainty washed over him with the force of seasonal rains. This was not simply another homeless woman seeking charity from market-goers, though her circumstances clearly placed her among Ouagadougou's most vulnerable residents. This was his mother, the woman who had given him life, who had loved him with fierce devotion before circumstances beyond her control had torn them apart forever. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the magnitude of this moment, the sheer statistical impossibility of this encounter. Around him, the market continued its rhythmic dance of commerce and community, vendors and customers negotiating prices and exchanging news, completely oblivious to the personal earthquake occurring in their president's heart. The irony was not lost on him. Here he stood, a man who had risen to lead a nation of over 21 million people, implementing policies designed to eliminate the very poverty that had claimed his mother as a victim. While he had been fighting colonial mentality in conference rooms and legislative chambers, she had been waging her own daily battle against its most direct and brutal consequences. Ibrahim's eyes focused with laser intensity on a distinctive crescent-shaped scar above her left wrist. And suddenly he was 5 years old again, tracing that same mark with tiny fingers, while she told him stories about how even scars could be beautiful because they showed survival and strength. His heart pounded against his ribs as memories flooded back with startling clarity, each detail confirming what his soul already knew to be true. She unconsciously touched her collarbone, a nervous habit he suddenly remembered from his earliest years. Something she did when thinking deeply or worrying about problems too large for easy solutions. The gesture was so achingly familiar that it unlocked a cascade of sensory memories. The way she would hum while preparing meals, the warmth of her embrace after childhood nightmares, the sound of her footsteps in their small compound. The small leather pouch she wore around her neck nearly brought him to his knees when he recognized it. The same traditional amulet that had held his umbilical cord according to Moray custom, a talisman meant to provide spiritual protection and maintain the mystical connection between mother and child, regardless of physical separation. She had kept it for 34 years, a tangible reminder of their bond even when hope seemed impossible. Her weathered hands told stories of adaptation and resilience that humbled him. The calluses spoke of manual labor, probably washing clothes by hand, carrying water over long distances, performing any of the 100 small jobs that formed the invisible economy sustaining Africa's urban poor. These were the same hands that had once braided his hair with gentle precision, prepared meals with love, and offered comfort during childhood illnesses. As if sensing the intensity of his gaze, the woman looked up again, this time studying his face with growing curiosity rather than the reflexive wariness of someone accustomed to being ignored or dismissed. Her humming stopped abruptly, and Ibrahim saw her eyes widen with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope that was almost painful to witness. She struggled to her feet with obvious difficulty. One weathered hand pressed against the wall for support, while the other clutched her begging cup with automatic protectiveness. Her lips moved silently, forming sounds that gradually resolved into a name she hadn't spoken in decades, his birth name, the intimate identifier that only she had ever used, connecting him to the child he had been before the world remade him into a leader. Recognition dawned in her eyes, like sunrise breaking over the Sahel, bringing with it tears that carved clean tracks through the dust and grime coating her cheeks. The tears seemed to wash away years of accumulated sorrow, revealing glimpses of the woman who had once been young and hopeful, who had sung lullabies and dreamed of watching her son grow into manhood. Ibrahim signaled subtly to his security detail, using hand gestures that communicated his need for space while maintaining their protective vigilance. Captain Ouedraogo nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding that this situation required extraordinary sensitivity rather than standard protocol, though his professional instincts remained on high alert as he assessed the emotional vulnerability of his principal. The president removed his simple watch, a gift from his adoptive father upon graduation from military academy, and slipped it into his pocket. He wanted to appear as ordinary as possible in this extraordinary moment, to approach as a son rather than a head of state whose presence was typically accompanied by ceremony and formal protocol. Every step toward his mother felt weighted with history and possibility. The market's afternoon rhythm continued around them, children playing elaborate games with bottle caps and sticks, vendors calling out prices as the day wound toward evening, motorcycles weaving through the crowd, with their familiar two-stroke symphony, creating perfect cover for this most intimate of reunions. Ibrahim's heart hammered against his ribs as he rehearsed opening words that could somehow encompass decades of loss, love, and longing. He chose to speak in Moray, their shared mother tongue, knowing that this linguistic intimacy would immediately establish deep connection that transcended their current circumstances and the formal French that dominated his official communications. "Excuse me, mother," he said softly as he approached her makeshift shelter, using the respectful term for an elder woman that was appropriate both for a stranger and for his actual parent. His voice carried the same gentle tone she would have remembered from childhood. though now deepened by age and shaped by the responsibilities of leadership. She looked up with the cautious wariness of someone who had learned through painful experience to be suspicious of unexpected attention, especially from well-dressed strangers who might represent authority, charity, or exploitation disguised as kindness. Her eyes searched his face for clues about his intentions, while her body language remained defensively guarded. Ibrahim knelt slowly in the red dust beside her shelter, deliberately ignoring the expensive fabric of his trousers as it touched the ground. This gesture of humility was calculated to demonstrate respect rather than pity, positioning himself at her eye level rather than looming above her with the unconscious arrogance of power or privilege that she had undoubtedly encountered from other officials. "I wonder if you might remember a little boy who used to sing the Baobab song with you many years ago," he said carefully, watching her face for any flicker of recognition. His words were chosen to unlock specific memories that only his mother would possess, references to shared experiences that could not be coincidental or mistaken. Her breathing became shallow as recognition began to dawn, hope and disbelief warring in her weathered features like seasonal winds competing for dominance over the landscape. Her hands, which had been clutching her begging cup with automatic protectiveness, began to tremble as possibilities too wonderful to believe took shape in her consciousness. The woman's eyes widened as she studied his face more intently, her gaze tracing features that had matured and strengthened, but still carried echoes of the child she had last seen 34 years earlier. She seemed afraid to trust what her heart was telling her, conditioned by years of disappointment to doubt even her most fervent hopes. Ibrahim remained perfectly still, allowing her the time and space to process this impossible moment at her own pace. He understood that his sudden appearance must seem like a dream or hallucination to someone whose daily existence was defined by harsh realities and disappointed expectations. Patience, he had learned in his political career, was often the most powerful tool for building trust and allowing truth to emerge naturally. Her weathered hands reached toward him tentatively, then stopped in mid-air as if afraid that touching him might cause this vision to dissolve like morning mist. The gesture was heartbreakingly familiar. She had always been hesitant to presume, even with her own son, always checking for permission before offering affection. "My son," she whispered in Moray, her voice barely audible above the market's ambient noise, but carrying the weight of decades of prayer and longing. The words seemed to surprise her even as she spoke them, as if giving voice to hope might somehow curse its fulfillment. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, cutting clean channels through the dust and grime accumulated on her face. These were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming joy mixed with disbelief. The emotional response of someone witnessing a miracle they had dreamed about but never dared expect. Ibrahim nodded gently, his own eyes filling with tears he had learned to control in presidential settings, but could not restrain in this moment of raw human connection. "Yes, Mama," he replied, using the intimate term he hadn't spoken in over 3 decades. "It's me. It's really me." The simple acknowledgement broke through years of separation like sunrise breaking over the savannah, illuminating a landscape that had been shrouded in darkness. Ibrahim slowly extended his hand, palm up, in the same gesture of trust and invitation they had shared when he was small and frightened by thunderstorms or bad dreams. She looked at his hand, strong, well cared for, bearing calluses from someone who still worked manually despite his elevated position, and saw both the child she remembered and the man he had become. Without the protocol and ceremony that usually surrounded his public appearances, he was simply a son finding his mother again. When she placed her weathered palm against his, the connection was electric, immediate, and overwhelmingly real. 34 years collapsed into nothing as skin touched skin and 2 hearts that had been separated by circumstances beyond their control finally found each other again. "I never stopped looking for you," she whispered, her voice breaking with decades of suppressed grief and desperate hope that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her life. Each word carried the weight of countless nights spent wondering, countless days spent searching faces in crowds, countless prayers offered to ancestors. and spirits asking for one more chance to see her. Son Ibrahim felt the weight of his public. Responsibilities fade into background noise as the most important. Role of his life, that of her son, took precedence over everything else. This moment belonged to them alone, unmarked by titles, positions, or the complex machinery of governance that usually defined his existence. After your father died, she continued, her voice gaining strength as memories long buried began to surface like groundwater during the rainy season. I tried everything to keep you. Her words painted pictures of desperation and love, of a young woman facing impossible choices with no good options and no safety net to cushion the impact of economic catastrophe. The drought of 1991 had been particularly devastating, destroying their small farm outside Koudougou and forcing her into the capital with nothing but hope and determination. Burkina Faso's rural economy, already fragile from decades of colonial exploitation and post-independence mismanagement, had collapsed entirely in many regions. Families who had farmed the same land for generations suddenly found themselves refugees in their own country. She described working as a house cleaner, a water carrier, a street food vendor, any job that would earn enough to feed them both in the tiny rented room that represented their only shelter in an unforgiving city. The work was physically brutal and poorly paid, but she had been willing to sacrifice her body and dignity for his welfare. But Ouagadougou in the 1990s was merciless to rural women without connections, education, or family networks to provide support during crises. Competition for unskilled work was fierce, and employers often took advantage of desperate women's vulnerability. When her primary employer made advances, she refused. The decision cost her the only stable income she had managed to secure. The landlord's patience ran out when she fell behind on rent, threatening eviction that would have left them sleeping in the streets. Social services, such as they were in a country with minimal public resources, threatened to remove Ibrahim from her care permanently if she could not demonstrate adequate housing and income within 30 days. In my mind, giving you to a family who could provide for you was an act of love, not abandonment, she explained, her eyes distant with memories that still caused physical pain after all these years. Every mother's worst nightmare being forced to choose between keeping her child close and ensuring his welfare had become her lived reality. She had promised herself that the separation would be temporary, that she would work harder, save money, and return for him once she had achieved some measure of stability. But weeks turned to months, and months stretched into years as mere survival became her only focus. The informal economy that sustained Ouagadougou's poor offered no job security, no benefits, no path toward accumulating the resources necessary to reclaim her son. She had kept his baby clothes in a small bundle that moved with her from place to place, always hoping that the next job would be the breakthrough that allowed her to rebuild their life together. These tangible reminders of their shared past became talismans that sustained her through the darkest periods of despair and doubt. The economic crisis of the late 1990s, triggered by fluctuations in commodity prices and structural adjustment policies that prioritized debt repayment over social welfare, crushed what little stability she had managed to build. Currency devaluation made basic necessities prohibitively expensive, while wages stagnated or disappeared entirely. She had searched for him countless times, visiting schools and orphanages, asking neighbors and community leaders if they knew anything about the family that had adopted him. But his new parents had moved without leaving forwarding information, perhaps understanding that maintaining contact with his birth mother might complicate their own relationship with the child they were raising as their son. Every night I wondered if you were warm, if you were happy, if you remembered my voice or the songs I used to sing, she said, fresh tears mixing with the accumulated dust on her weathered cheeks. The not knowing had been perhaps the cruelest aspect of their separation, wondering whether he was thriving or suffering, whether his adoptive family treated him with kindness, whether he ever thought about the mother who had been forced to let him go. She had followed news about the young Captain Ibrahim Traoré with growing pride and incredulous hope, recognizing something achingly familiar in his passion for justice and his commitment to Africa's liberation from neo-colonial exploitation. His speeches about sovereignty and dignity echoed values she had tried to instill during their brief years together. But the distance between a homeless woman surviving on the streets and a national leader seemed insurmountable. Even as her maternal heart whispered possibilities she dared not voice. She had watched his televised addresses from small screens in market stalls, seeing echoes of the child she remembered in his gestures and expressions. Her greatest fear was that he might hate her for the choice she had been forced to make, not understanding the impossible circumstances that had left her with no alternatives. She worried that success and education might have convinced him that her decision was cowardice rather than sacrifice. Abandonment rather than love. I never remarried. Never had other children, she revealed. Her voice barely audible but filled with profound truth that recontextualized her entire adult life. Every decision since losing him had been shaped by the hope that someday they would be reunited, that her sacrifice would prove meaningful rather than merely tragic. She had turned down opportunities to leave Burkina Faso, staying close to where she had last seen him, even as economic conditions deteriorated and survival became increasingly difficult. Her life had become a vigil sustained by maternal love and stubborn faith in eventual reunion. "You became everything I prayed for," she whispered, reaching toward his face with trembling fingers that stopped just short of touching. This moment validated every difficult choice, every night of hunger, every day of longing that had defined her existence since their separation. The child she had loved was, now, a leader fighting for the very justice she had always believed. In the dam of 34 years of suppressed, emotion burst as Ibrahim finally took his mother's weathered hands in his own. Her touch was exactly as he remembered, yet startlingly different. The same gentle warmth, but marked now by calluses that spoke of decades of hard labor, skin roughened by exposure to elements and hardship that should never have been her burden to bear. "Mama, I searched for you too," he whispered, his presidential composure completely dissolving as tears streamed down his face without restraint or shame. The careful emotional control that was essential to political leadership crumbled in the face of this reunion, revealing the vulnerable human being beneath the public persona. She pulled him closer with surprising strength, and he allowed himself to be embraced like the child he had once been in her arms. The familiar scent of shea butter still lingered on her skin, though now mixed with the harsh realities of street life, dust, sweat, and the particular odor of poverty that comes from inadequate access to clean water and safe shelter. Around them, curious market vendors began to notice the unusual scene of a well-dressed man weeping in the arms of an elderly homeless woman. Some recognized their president, their initial confusion giving way to whispered speculation about what could have prompted such an emotional display from their usually composed leader, but neither mother nor son cared about the growing attention or the implications this public moment might have for Ibrahim's political image. They existed only for each other, reconnecting across decades of separation with an intensity that made everything else irrelevant. My beautiful boy, she repeated, her voice breaking with each repetition as she cradled his face with hands that remembered every feature from childhood. Ibrahim felt the texture of her palms, rougher now, marked by years of manual labor, but infinitely precious, because they belonged to the woman who had first shown him what love meant. She traced the small scar on his forehead from a childhood fall, the mark he had earned while learning to ride a bicycle in the courtyard of their small compound. Her fingers remembered rushing him to the local clinic on her back, holding him while the nurse cleaned and bandaged the wound, singing softly to distract him from the pain. Her tears fell onto his shirt as she whispered apologies for choices that had never been choices at all, but desperate responses to circumstances that no parent should ever face. Each apology cut him more deeply than any political attack or international criticism ever could. The President of Burkina Faso wept openly, completely unguarded, not caring who might see their leader in this moment of absolute vulnerability. The image of strength and authority that was so carefully maintained in public settings meant nothing compared to being held by the woman who had given him life. "I became who I am because of what you taught me," Ibrahim said through his tears, his voice thick with emotion and gratitude that had been accumulating for decades. He needed her to understand that her sacrifice had not been meaningless, that the values she had instilled during their brief time together had shaped every decision. In his rise to leadership, even their short years together had been sufficient to plant seeds that grew into his passion for justice, his commitment to Africa's sovereignty, his belief in the dignity and potential of ordinary people. The lullabies she sang had contained wisdom about community and shared responsibility that now informed his policies and worldview. Her stories about their ancestors' resistance to colonialism had awakened his consciousness about the ongoing struggle for true independence. The way she had treated everyone with respect regardless of their social status had taught him that authentic leadership meant serving others rather than being served by them. She listened with wonder as he described how her influence had rippled through his life in ways she could never have imagined, shaping the man and leader he had become. Her sacrifice, though painful beyond description, had ultimately contributed to something larger than either of them had imagined possible. Captain Ouedraogo approached cautiously, his trained eyes continuously scanning the emotional reunion and the growing crowd it was attracting. His professional assessment of the situation grew more concerning by the minute, as word spread through the market about their president's unexpected presence and dramatic emotional display. Several people had already begun discreetly photographing the scene with their mobile phones, and Ouedraogo could see the viral potential of images showing Burkina Faso's young president weeping in the arms of a homeless woman. While the captain didn't yet understand the personal significance of this encounter, he recognized the tactical vulnerabilities it was creating with each passing moment. "Sir, we need to consider moving to a more secure location," he whispered respectfully, positioning himself to shield Ibrahim from the most curious onlookers while maintaining visual contact with his other team members stationed around the market's perimeter. The captain understood that this was clearly a moment of profound personal importance, but his responsibility was to protect the president from all potential threats. Political opponents could weaponize this situation in multiple ways, questioning Ibrahim's judgment in traveling with minimal security, exploiting the emotional imagery for propaganda purposes, or using the distraction to plan more serious attacks. His job was to anticipate threats that his principal might be too emotionally compromised to recognize. The growing crowd included not just curious market-goers drawn by the unusual spectacle, but also individuals whose positioning and behavior suggested surveillance rather than casual interest. Ouedraogo identified at least 3 men whose body language indicated possible hostile intent, their focus too intense and their movements too calculated to be coincidental. "Mr. President, your mother's safety is also at risk now," Ouedraogo added quietly, recognizing that this argument might carry more weight than concerns for Ibrahim's own security. The woman who had survived decades on the streets through invisibility and careful anonymity now faced exposure that could make her a target for those seeking leverage against her. Son Ibrahim looked up from his mother's embrace, his tear-streaked face showing the internal conflict between his roles as son and national leader. He understood Captain Ouedraogo's concerns intellectually while struggling to balance security protocols with the profound personal significance of this reunion. "Give us 5 more minutes," he said firmly, his voice carrying unmistakable authority despite his emotional state. His mother looked confused by the sudden tension, not fully understanding the complex security considerations that now surrounded what had been her simple, anonymous existence just moments before. The president made a rapid decision that would prioritize both their safety and their need for privacy to process this miraculous reunion properly. "Then we move to a more appropriate location," he added, already calculating how to protect this precious relationship while maintaining his responsibilities to 21 million Burkinabe citizens. Within hours of their reunion, Ibrahim had mobilized a discreet network of trusted allies to address his mother's immediate needs, without creating the kind of public spectacle that would compromise either her safety or his political position. The speed and efficiency with which these arrangements were made demonstrated both his administrative capabilities and the depth of loyalty he inspired among his inner circle. Dr. Aminata Sawadago, his personal physician and one of his oldest friends dating back to their university days, was the first to be contacted. A woman of impeccable discretion whose medical practice served many of Ouagadougou's prominent families, she understood immediately the delicate nature of the situation and agreed to conduct a private health assessment without asking unnecessary questions. A modest but comfortable apartment in Sector 15, a middle-class neighborhood known for its quiet residential character and diverse population, was secured through carefully chosen intermediaries who understood the need for absolute confidentiality. The location was selected for its strategic advantages, far enough from government buildings to avoid association with official activities, yet close enough for Ibrahim to visit regularly without attracting attention. Ibrahim's chief of staff, Bourema Zerbo, a brilliant administrator who had proven his loyalty during the coup that brought Ibrahim to power, coordinated the delivery of basic necessities with military precision. Furniture, clothing appropriate for a woman of his mother's age and dignified circumstances, non-perishable food items, and household essentials were sourced from multiple vendors to avoid creating patterns that might attract unwanted attention. The president insisted that every action be taken, with his mother's dignity as the primary consideration, not his political image or convenience. He had learned from his years in opposition politics that authentic leadership meant making decisions based on principles rather than expedience, even when those decisions created personal or political complications. No government resources were used directly in these arrangements, a decision that reflected both legal propriety and Ibrahim's personal ethical standards. Instead, he drew from his modest personal savings, accumulated during his years as a military officer and augmented by the simple lifestyle he maintained even as president, and accepted help from loyal friends who understood that supporting his mother meant supporting him. Ibrahim personally visited the space before his mother moved in, spending an afternoon ensuring that it felt like a home rather than a safe house or charity arrangement. He tested the plumbing, checked that electrical systems were functional, and made sure the small kitchen was equipped with everything necessary for preparing traditional meals. A small garden space behind the building was cleared and prepared so she could grow the herbs and vegetables that would connect her to the agricultural traditions of her rural origins. This detail reflected Ibrahim's understanding that healing from trauma required not just physical security, but also psychological comfort and cultural continuity. He arranged for Tanti Marie, an elderly woman from his extended network of political allies, to serve as both companion and gentle guide in his mother's adjustment to stable housing after decades of street life. Marie was chosen for her combination of discretion, kindness, and practical wisdom, someone who could provide social support without being intrusive or condescending. The refrigerator was stocked with traditional foods his mother had loved during their years together. Fresh vegetables from local markets, high-quality rice and millet, dried fish from the northern regions, and ingredients necessary for preparing the simple, nutritious meals that connected her to her cultural identity and personal history. Medical care was arranged through a private clinic known for serving prominent families with absolute discretion. Dr. Sawadogo would oversee treatment for malnutrition and various health issues that inevitably resulted from decades of exposure to harsh weather, inadequate nutrition, and chronic stress of survival-focused living. Every detail was planned meticulously to restore his mother's dignity while respecting her independence and autonomy. The goal was not to make her dependent on charity or government assistance, but to provide the foundation she needed to rebuild her life on her own terms. Ibrahim established a routine of visiting his mother every evening after completing his official duties, typically arriving near sunset when the neighborhood was quiet and his presence would be least likely to attract unwanted attention. These visits became the most important part of his daily schedule. Taking precedence over all but the most urgent state business, he would park his modest personal vehicle, the same Toyota he had driven as a military officer, several blocks away and walk casually through the neighborhood streets, like any son visiting his elderly mother. The simple normalcy of these walks provided psychological relief from the constant pressure and protocol that defined his professional existence. Their conversations during these precious hours focused on healing wounds left by 34 years of separation and slowly rebuilding their relationship on the foundation of love that had never diminished despite physical distance. These were not political discussions or policy briefings, but intimate exchanges between two people reconnecting across decades of forced separation. She insisted on cooking for him despite his protests, that she should rest and focus on recovering her health. After years of malnutrition and exposure, her determination to care for her son, even in small ways, was clearly essential to her. Psychological healing, a way of reclaiming her role as his mother after being denied that function for so long. The meals she prepared were simple but infused with love and memory. Traditional dishes from their shared past that triggered powerful emotional responses in both of them. The act of eating together restored rhythms of family life that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control, creating new memories to overlay the painful ones of separation. He learned about her survival strategies during the decades they had been apart, the friendships she had formed among Ouagadougou's homeless population, and the inner strength that had sustained her through circumstances that would have destroyed many people. Her stories revealed resilience and dignity that humbled him and deepened his understanding of human potential under the most adverse conditions. She told him about informal networks of mutual aid that existed among street dwellers, how they shared food, protected each other from violence, and provided emotional support during the darkest periods of despair. These relationships, formed under the most difficult circumstances, often demonstrated more genuine solidarity than formal institutions of civil society. Her descriptions of daily survival strategies provided Ibrahim with insights into poverty that no policy briefing or academic study could convey. She explained how to identify which vendors might have leftover food at closing time, which public spaces were safe for sleeping, and how to maintain personal hygiene and dignity without access to proper facilities. These quiet evenings became sacred time for both of them, unmarked by presidential protocol or public expectations. The leader of Burkina Faso was simply a son spending time with his mother, sharing meals and memories in peaceful solitude away from the demands of governance and scrutiny of public life. The transformation in both of them was gradual but remarkable. His mother's health improved dramatically with regular meals, medical care, and psychological healing that came from being loved and valued rather than ignored and dismissed. Her natural dignity, suppressed by years of survival-focused living, began to shine through as she regained confidence and security. Ibrahim watched with profound satisfaction as his mother reclaimed her sense of self-worth and began to engage with the world from a position of security rather than desperate need. She maintained contact with some friends from the streets, quietly sharing resources with those still struggling, demonstrating the generous spirit that had always defined her character. 6 months after their reunion, Ibrahim's mother had undergone a remarkable transformation that extended far beyond her improved physical health and secure housing. The woman who had once survived through uncertain charity of strangers had evolved into a quiet force for community, organizing and social support among Ouagadougou's most vulnerable residents. Her small apartment in Sector 15 had become an informal community center where homeless mothers could find temporary shelter, warm meals, and practical advice for navigating the complex bureaucracy of social services. The space, originally intended as her private refuge, had been opened to others facing similar struggles because she could not bear to enjoy security while knowing that other women remained exposed to the same dangers she had endured. Her experience surviving on the streets provided her with unique credibility among Ouagadougou's most marginalized residents, who trusted her in ways they would never trust official government representatives or formal charitable organizations. She understood their fears, their survival strategies, and their dreams because she had lived them herself. Word spread through informal networks that connected the city's homeless population that Mama Ibrahim was helping women transition from street life to stability. but she insisted on maintaining anonymity in these efforts. She had learned from her son's example that true leadership meant serving others without seeking recognition or personal benefit from one's actions. Dr. Sawadogo, during monthly health checkups, noticed remarkable improvements in both her patients' physical and mental health as she found purpose in supporting other women facing similar struggles. Her blood pressure had stabilized, her chronic malnutrition had been completely addressed, and psychological assessments showed dramatic improvements in mood, self-esteem, and life satisfaction. The transformation from recipient of aid to provider of hope illustrated the potential that existed within every person that society had written off as hopeless or worthless. Her natural leadership qualities, suppressed by years of survival-focused living, flourished once she had the security and resources necessary to think beyond her own immediate needs. Ibrahim watched his mother's community work with profound pride, recognizing how her innate compassion and practical wisdom were creating ripple effects throughout the neighborhood and beyond. During their evening visits, she would share stories about the women she was helping, their resilience, their dreams for their children, their innovative strategies for survival in an economic system that offered them few legitimate opportunities. These conversations deepened his understanding of poverty's impact on families and directly informed his approach to developing social policies affecting women and children. The abstract statistics and academic research that typically informed policy discussions were given human faces and personal dimensions through his mother's detailed knowledge of individual cases. Her feedback helped him design government initiatives that preserved dignity while providing support, avoiding paternalistic approaches that often characterized international development programs. She had strong opinions about which types of assistance actually helped people and which merely created dependency or bureaucratic obstacles. Following the model of their own reunion, Ibrahim found himself becoming a more effective leader through these intimate lessons in authentic community organizing and grassroots problem-solving. The personal healing that came from rebuilding their relationship provided emotional stability that enhanced his professional judgment and decision-making abilities. Despite Ibrahim's careful efforts to maintain privacy, news of the reunion began spreading through Ouagadougou's intricate network of neighborhood gossip and market whispers with the unstoppable force of seasonal rains. In a city where everyone seemed connected to everyone else through extended family relationships, professional associations, or shared origins in the same rural villages, secrets rarely remained hidden for long. Fatoumata, a fabric vendor who had witnessed the emotional meeting at the central market, initially tried to keep the story to herself out of respect for the president's privacy. But the power of what she had seen, a national leader weeping in the arms of a homeless woman, proved too significant to contain within her own conscience. She shared the story first with her sister, swearing her to secrecy, but her sister told her neighbor, who mentioned it to her husband, and soon the tale was rippling across the city like the call to prayer, echoing from mosque to mosque. Each telling added new details or interpretations, but the core elements remained consistent enough to maintain credibility. The first social media posts appeared within 3 days of the reunion, blurry photographs of Ibrahim kneeling beside the elderly woman, accompanied by speculation and wonder from ordinary citizens who were trying to understand what they had witnessed or heard described by friends and family members, unlike typical political scandals that divided public opinion along ethnic, religious, or ideological lines. This story seemed to unite Burkina Faso across all traditional boundaries in a shared emotional response. The narrative transcended usual divisions that characterized political discourse, touching something universal about family love and human dignity. Women, who had struggled to raise children alone in the face of economic hardship, saw themselves reflected in his mother's sacrifice and resilience. They understood the impossible choices that poverty forced upon loving parents, the way systemic failures created personal tragedies that individual effort alone could not overcome. Young people who had risen from humble beginnings felt vindicated in their belief that greatness could emerge from any circumstances, that success did not require abandoning one's roots or forgetting the people who had shaped one's character during formative years. The story resonated powerfully because it embodied the best of traditional Moray values, respect for elders, loyalty to family, and the understanding that true success meant lifting others rather than climbing over them. These cultural touchstones gave the narrative emotional weight that transcended political considerations. Traditional griots began incorporating the reunion into their storytelling repertoires, weaving it into the broader oral history of Ibrahim's leadership as destiny fulfilled through divine providence and ancestral protection. Their performances in villages across the country spread the story to populations that had limited access to modern media. Radio stations received an unprecedented volume of calls from listeners sharing their own stories of family separation and reunion, creating an unexpected national dialogue about poverty's impact on African family structures and the resilience required to survive systematic economic marginalization. In villages throughout Burkina Faso, elderly residents nodded knowingly as they heard the story, recognizing patterns they had witnessed countless times throughout their lives. Economic hardship forcing impossible choices upon loving parents, children separated from their origins by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The narrative challenged Western stereotypes about African family structures, demonstrating instead the profound sacrifices parents made for their children's welfare and the enduring bonds that survived even decades of physical separation. International media found themselves unable to frame the story negatively without appearing callous or culturally insensitive. Ibrahim's public speeches began incorporating new themes and perspectives that reflected the personal transformation he was undergoing through his rebuilt relationship with his mother. While he continued to champion African sovereignty and resistance to neo-colonial exploitation, his rhetoric became more nuanced, showing deeper understanding of how international political issues affected individual families and communities. His address to the African Union Summit 6 months after the reunion included passages about the importance of social safety nets and family stability that surprised international observers who had previously characterized him primarily as a military leader focused on security and anti-Western positions. True sovereignty, he declared to the assembled heads of state, begins with ensuring that no parent in Africa is forced to choose between keeping their children close and providing for their basic needs. When families are torn apart by economic desperation, we have failed our most fundamental obligation as leaders. The speech received standing ovations from delegates representing countries across the continent, many of whom had experienced similar family separations in their own backgrounds or among their populations. His personal story had become a vehicle for discussing broader policy issues that affected millions of African families. International observers noted a new warmth and authenticity in his leadership style, attributing it to increased emotional intelligence and personal confidence. Diplomatic meetings that had previously been characterized by tension and confrontation became more collaborative as Ibrahim's reputation for sincerity and genuine concern for his people enhanced his credibility. The president, who had once spoken primarily about military resistance and anti-imperialism, now also championed social programs that strengthened family bonds and community resilience. His budget allocations increasingly reflected priorities that addressed the root causes of social displacement rather than merely managing its symptoms. Healthcare funding was redirected toward maternal and child health programs that could prevent the kind of malnutrition and preventable diseases that made families vulnerable to economic catastrophe. Education investments focused on keeping children in school even when families faced financial crises, recognizing that educational disruption often perpetuated cycles of poverty. Housing policy was reformed to prevent the kind of exploitative landlord practices that had contributed to his mother's original displacement from stable shelter. New regulations required longer eviction notice periods and provided emergency assistance for families facing temporary financial difficulties. Job creation programs were designed specifically to provide employment opportunities for women who had been marginalized by formal economic structures. These initiatives drew directly on his mother's recommendations about what kinds of work were accessible to women with limited formal education but extensive practical skills. As their story gradually became public knowledge through carefully managed revelations and media coverage, it began inspiring similar reunions across West Africa and beyond. Social media networks and diaspora community organizations facilitated searches for separated family members, with people using the president's example as motivation to pursue their own difficult family reconnections. The narrative challenged persistent stereotypes about African leadership by demonstrating a model where personal vulnerability and authentic relationships strengthened, rather than weakened political authority. Instead of the distant, authoritarian figures that had characterized much of post-colonial African governance, Ibrahim represented a new generation of leaders who drew power from their connections to ordinary citizens rather than their separation from them. International relations scholars began referencing the reunion as a case study in how personal authenticity could reshape diplomatic relationships and soft power projection. Countries seeking to build stronger partnerships with Burkina Faso found that understanding and respecting the story's significance opened doors to more productive negotiations. Development organizations working across Africa began incorporating family stability measures into their program evaluations, recognizing that successful development required maintaining social bonds rather than merely achieving economic growth statistics that might mask underlying social disruption. Universities teaching African studies, international development, and political science added the story to their curricula as an example of how personal narratives could illuminate broader structural issues and policy challenges. Students were assigned to analyze the reunion as a lens for understanding poverty, governance, and social policy in developing countries. The narrative influenced artistic productions across the continent, with filmmakers, musicians, and writers creating works inspired by themes of separation, resilience, and reunion that resonated with audiences who had experienced similar family disruptions caused by economic migration or political instability. Religious leaders across multiple faiths used the story in sermons and teachings about family responsibility, social justice, and the importance of caring for society's most vulnerable members. The reunion became a parable that transcended religious boundaries while reinforcing shared values about human dignity and community support. 3 years after that life-changing afternoon in Ouagadougou's Central Market, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, addressing world leaders about Africa's path toward genuine independence and sustainable development. In his speech, without explicitly mentioning his personal story, he spoke with the authority of someone who understood poverty not as an abstract policy challenge, but as a lived experience that had shaped his family's history. When we speak of development, he told the assembled delegates, we must remember that behind every statistic is a human story. Mothers separated from children by economic desperation, families torn apart by systems that prioritize profit over people. Communities displaced by policies designed in distant capitals without regard for their human cost. His words carried the weight of personal knowledge, the credibility that came from understanding these issues through intimate experience rather than academic study. The standing ovation that followed was not merely diplomatic courtesy, but genuine recognition of authentic leadership rooted in human understanding. Back in Burkina Faso, his mother watched the speech on television from her comfortable apartment, surrounded by women she had helped transition from homelessness to stability. Some were now employed, others had started small businesses, and several had been reunited with their own children. Through the support networks she had helped establish, the community center that had grown from her small apartment had been formalized into a registered nonprofit organization, but it retained the informal, peer-to-peer approach that made it effective. Government social workers often referred cases to Mama, Ibrahim's network, because they achieved better outcomes than traditional institutional approaches. Her transformation from street beggar to community leader had become a model, studied by development organizations across Africa. Universities sent social work students to learn from her methods, and government officials from other countries visited to understand how informal support networks could be supported without being bureaucratized. Ibrahim's evening visits continued. Though they now included grandchildren, his wife had given birth to twins the previous year, and his mother's joy in helping care for them had added new dimensions to their relationship. She sang the same lullabies to his children that she had once sung to him, maintaining cultural continuity across generations. The babies seemed to recognize her voice intuitively, settling into peaceful sleep when she held them. Ibrahim watched these interactions with profound satisfaction, seeing the healing of generational trauma and the restoration of family bonds that would shape his children's understanding of love and security. As Ibrahim prepared for his re-election campaign, the story remained central to his political identity, but it had evolved from a personal narrative into evidence of his governing philosophy. Voters understood that his policies on healthcare, education, and social protection were not political calculations but expressions of values forged through lived experience. The woman who had once survived on the uncertain charity of market-goers had become a respected elder whose wisdom was sought by academics, policymakers, and community organizers. Her insights about poverty, resilience, and community organizing had influenced social policy across multiple countries. As the sun set over Ouagadougou on another evening visit, Ibrahim sat with his mother in her small garden, watching his children play among the vegetables she had taught them to tend. The baobab tree visible beyond the compound wall reminded him of the lullabies she had sung about its strength and endurance. "You know," she said quietly, watching her grandchildren with obvious contentment, "I used to think that losing you was the worst thing that could happen to a mother. But now I understand that it was all part of a larger plan. You needed to grow into the leader our people needed, and I needed to understand their struggles so I could help you serve them better." Ibrahim nodded, understanding that their separation and reunion had indeed served purposes larger than their individual happiness. Their story had become a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstances, the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds, and the way personal authenticity could enhance, rather than compromise, public service. The president and his mother had found each other again, but more importantly, they had found ways to use their healing to contribute to the healing of their community and nation. Their love had become a foundation for justice, their reunion a symbol of hope for millions who believed that no separation was permanent and no circumstances insurmountable, as the stars emerged over the capital city of a country still working toward its full potential. Ibrahim Traoré understood that his greatest accomplishment was not his rise to political power, but the restoration of the relationship that had given his life its deepest meaning. In finding his mother again, he had found the foundation for authentic leadership that could transform not just individual lives but entire societies. The market where they had been reunited continued its daily rhythms of commerce and community, but it now carried additional significance as the place where love had triumphed over circumstance, where family bonds had proven stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy them, and where the possibility of redemption and renewal had been demonstrated for all who needed hope in their own struggles. Their story would be told for generations, not just as political biography, but as human testimony to the enduring power of love, the possibility of healing, and the way authentic relationships could serve as the foundation for transformational leadership that changed the world one life at a time.